All right, guys, welcome back. So far, we've been looking at what happens to a cell when it uses diffusion. But what about if it needs to move things in the opposite direction? That's what we're going to take a look at now. So here's nature's way. We've talked about this with diffusion. Things naturally move down a concentration gradient, just like a bike would naturally move down a hill from an area of high to an area of low. What happens then when we want to move from an area of low to an area of high? How are we going to get there? And there's really only one way to get there through nature, and that is to add energy to the system. Cells add energy to a system by using something called active transport. Active transport gets its name because it's how a cell uses energy to actively move materials across the cell's membrane against the concentration gradient. That means that the cell is moving materials from an area of low concentration up to an area of high concentration. And just to reiterate that, it has to use energy to do this. Just like if you were pedaling that bike, if you wanted to go uphill, you're going to have to pedal hard, whereas you can coast downhill. So let's look at one example of active transport. It's called a protein pump. So here we've got a cellular membrane, a lipid bilayer, and it's got this specialized protein in it. Okay. Now, if we look on one side of the cell membrane, we have a low concentration, while on the other side, we have a high concentration of particles. Now, in this example, whatever these little blue X's are, the cell wants to get them from the area of low into the area of high, while nature wants to move these things from an area of high to an area of low. So what the cell is going to have to do is it's going to have to add energy to this little protein here. And when it does that, the protein changes shape from being open one way to being open the other. So what it does is this particle right here happens to just kind of diffuse into this protein, and then energy is added to the system. The protein kicks open and kicks that particle into the area of high concentration. But there's more than just protein pumps. Cells can do this in lots of different ways. Let's just take a look at 3 examples. Our first example is called phagocytosis. And in phagocytosis, what happens is a cell will surround and engulf really, really large particles, which normally wouldn't be able to diffuse at all. We also call this cell eating. It comes from the word phago, which means to eat, and cyto meaning cell. So literally it means eat cell. So here in our example, we've got some sort of cell here, an amoeboid type cell, and there's this large particle, could be a bacteria that it's going to engulf and bring into it. It has to use energy to do this. First step is to recognize that particle. The next step is for the cytoplasm in the cell membrane to start wrapping around that particle. After it wraps around, it's totally engulfed. The cell membrane on either side of that engulfing part there come together, and eventually it'll actually fuse together and pinch off, creating this little vesicle on the inside with the particle. Now normally that could be the end, but we could take it a step further and say that that particle will then be digested and the energy or the other parts of it could be used by something in the cell. Some examples of things that use this: amoebas, which are a single-celled organism. We actually have them on our teeth, and the white blood cells that patrol our body looking for invaders such as virus and bacteria. Another method of active transport is called pinocytosis. It's just like phagocytosis, but instead of taking in big particles, it's mostly just taking in water. This is called cell drinking, coming from the word pino, to drink, and cyto meaning cell. Here's our example of pinocytosis. So we have a concentration of water here, and it wants to bring it into the cell. So what happens is the membrane actually starts to dip, and these particles naturally kind of move in there. It creates kind of this little bubble shape, eventually pinches off, forming a vesicle full of water. Our last example is kind of the opposite of pinocytosis, and it's called exocytosis. Exo means out, so it's getting things out of the cell. And cells do this to sort of expel unwanted materials, or also to kind of drop off things that they've been making, such as proteins. I think of it as like pinocytosis in reverse, or if you really want to get gross, we can call it cell barfing. And here's our example. So in this cell, we've got a little vesicle. It could be waste materials or something that the cell wants out. So it'll use energy to move that vesicle to the cell wall. Once it reaches, or the cell membrane rather, once it reaches the cell membrane, it will bond to that membrane. The membranes of the vesicle will actually fuse with the membrane, and it'll open up, and the waste will actually be physically forced out into the extracellular fluid around the cell. And finally, that waste can then diffuse away or diffuse into the bloodstream to get rid of it. So there you go, 3 examples of active transport: phagocytosis, pinocytosis, and exocytosis.